Imagine being buried alive, dressed as a bride, with nothing but a lamp, some bread, and water to keep you company in your underground tomb. This wasn't a nightmare or a horror story. This was the real punishment that awaited women who broke their sacred vows in ancient Rome. The condemned woman would be led through the forum in a wedding dress, but instead of walking toward marriage, she was walking toward death. Citizens would watch in silence as she disappeared into an underground chamber, knowing she would never emerge. The entrance would be sealed with stones and earth, leaving her to suffocate in complete darkness. But here's what makes this even more chilling. These weren't criminals or enemies of the state. These were the Vestal Virgins, the most honoured and respected women in all of Rome. They lived like royalty, owned property, and had privileges that no other Roman women could dream of. So what could drive Rome to bury its most sacred women alive? Today we're uncovering the dark truth behind the Vestal Virgins and the most terrifying ritual in ancient Rome that wasn't a myth. In ancient Rome, the path to becoming a Vestal Virgin began not in adulthood, but in early childhood. Girls between the ages of 6 and 10 were selected to take on one of the most sacred and demanding roles in Roman religion. The selection of a Vestal was a rare and special occasion, and as only 6 served at any one time, it was carried out by the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, whose word carried enormous authority. When the time came to appoint a new Vestal, he would summon candidates from noble families and make the final choice through a formal ceremony known as a captio, a Latin word that literally means capture. It reflected the fact that the chosen girl was taken away from her family and placed into the service of the goddess Vesta, with little consideration for her own wishes. But what these families didn't know was that they were potentially signing their daughter's death warrant. The requirements for becoming a Vestal were strict and carefully designed to project the ideal of purity. First, the girls had to be free-born, meaning both parents were Roman citizens of good standing. Both parents also had to be alive, since orphans were not considered suitable for such a sacred duty. The family itself had to be respectable and unblemished by scandal, and the girl could not have had the slightest physical imperfection or mental defect. These conditions, though harsh, reveal how closely the Romans linked the image of the Vestals to the health of the state. The Vestal Virgins were not just individuals, they symbolized the purity and continuity of Rome itself. In the early centuries of the Republic, the chosen girls almost always came from the wealthiest patrician family. For these families, having a daughter selected was considered a high honor, because it placed their household directly into the heart of Rome's religious life. Yet, as time passed, fewer families were willing to part with their daughters for such a long and restrictive life. By the late Republic and into the Empire, the rules relaxed, and even the daughters of freedmen, men who had once been slaves, became eligible. This change reflected the growing difficulty of convincing Rome's elite to sacrifice their children to such a demanding role. The moment of selection was both public and emotional. Historical sources describe how families often wept when their daughter's name was called. On the surface, they were supposed to rejoice, because the family's honor was now tied to one of the most sacred offices in the city. But beneath the pride, there was deep grief. Everyone knew that the girl's childhood was ending in that instant. She would not grow up in her family's home, surrounded by siblings and parents, but in the Atrium Vestae, the house of the Vestals. Once chosen, she no longer belonged to her parents, or even to herself. She belonged to Vesta, and through Vesta, she belonged to Rome. The captio ceremony itself added to the sense of finality. The Pontifex Maximus would take the girl by the hand and declare her amata capta, which means beloved, captured. This formula symbolized both affection and loss. The girl was publicly recognized as someone special, chosen by divine will, but she was also removed from her family forever. Ancient writers noted that the act resembled a wedding ritual, with the priest playing the role of the one who gives the girl away. In this case, however, the bridegroom was not a man, but a goddess and an entire state. Once the ritual was complete, the girl was led away from her family's house. For her parents and siblings, this was often the last time they would see her as part of their household. She was escorted to the Forum, the bustling centre of Roman political and religious life, and then into the small circular temple of Vesta. From that day onward, the temple and the adjoining residence became her new world. The noise and warmth of family life were replaced with sacred duties, strict rules, and constant observation. Once a girl was chosen to become a Vestal Virgin, her life was mapped out for the next 3 decades. Service was divided into 3 clear stages, each lasting 10 years. In the first decade, the young Vestal was devoted entirely to learning. She was instructed by the older priestesses, who taught her the sacred rituals, the prayers, and the rules that had to be followed without error. Every detail mattered, from the way incense was burned to the manner of carrying sacred water. Mistakes were not seen as small slips, but as signs of divine displeasure, and so the training years were both strict and demanding. The second decade was the true period of service. By this time, the Vesta was expected to take on the full responsibilities of her role. She joined in the great ceremonies of Rome, worked within the temple, and most importantly, helped maintain the sacred fire of Vesta. The flame had to burn without interruption. Day and night, through war and peace, the fire was never allowed to die. To the Romans, this eternal flame was more than just a source of light. It was the beating heart of the city, representing the security and stability of the empire itself. If the fire went out, many believed it foretold disaster for the state. The duties of the Vestals extended beyond the fire. They prepared sacred food used in religious rituals, such as the special cakes called molla salsa, made from water and salt, which played a key role in sacrifices. They also fetched water from a sacred spring, never from the common city supply, because ordinary water was considered unfit for holy use. During festivals, they participated in rituals that reminded the Roman people of their connection to the gods. Though their tasks might sound simple, every act carried deep symbolic meaning. Each one reinforced the idea that the Vestals were guardians of Rome's fortune. The final decade of service was dedicated to teaching. Older Vestals, having gained long experience, became mentors to the younger girls who had just entered the order. They ensured that the strict traditions were passed down accurately. This system of learning, serving, and teaching kept the role of the Vestals consistent for centuries, even as Rome itself grew from a small city-state into a vast empire. The fire itself stood at the center of this entire system. Romans saw the hearth as the most important place in any household. It was where food was cooked, where warmth was found, and where family gathered. By keeping Vesta's flame alive in the temple, the Vestals symbolically kept the household of Rome alive. The temple's fire was, in their eyes, the fire of every home in the city. If it was strong, the city was strong. If it faltered, Rome itself was in danger. This symbolism gave the Vestals a weight of responsibility that no other woman in Rome carried. The Vestals were unmarried and bound to chastity, yet in another sense they were viewed as the mothers of all Romans. They were not mothers to children of their own, but guardians of an entire civilization. Their purity, both physical and spiritual, was tied directly to the survival of the state. This belief gave their role immense honor, but it also placed them under enormous scrutiny. Every day of their service, the eyes of Rome were upon them, trusting that these women would preserve the favor of the gods. In Rome, most women lived under the authority of their fathers, husbands, or brothers. They could not vote, they could not make legal contracts without a male guardian, and their movements were limited. Against this background, the Vestal Virgins seemed to occupy a completely different world. Once chosen, they were freed from the patria potestas, the power of the father, and gained rights almost no other Roman woman enjoyed. A Vestal could own property in her own name, something ordinary women were denied. She could write her own will and leave her belongings to whomever she chose. In court, her testimony carried unique authority. Unlike other witnesses, she did not have to take an oath because her word was considered pure and unquestionable. These powers gave her an influence in legal and political matters that would have been unimaginable for a Roman matron. Her privileges extended into daily life as well. While the streets of Rome were often crowded and dirty, the Vestals did not have to push their way through them. They were carried in covered carriages, escorted by attendants, and always given the right of way. At public games in the Colosseum, where thousands struggled to secure a seat, the Vestals were placed in reserved rows at the very front, alongside senators and emperors. This position showed that they were not only respected, but also seen as part of the core identity of Rome itself. Their home too reflected this elevated status. The Atrium Vestae, their residence next to the Temple of Vesta in the Forum, grew over time into a grand palace. Archaeological remains reveal marble floors, fountains, spacious courtyards, and even a heating system. Statues of past Vestals stood in the corridor, each inscribed with her name and virtues, a permanent reminder of the honour the role carried. For a girl taken from her family at the age of 6 or 7, this palace became her world for the next 30 years. Roman citizens treated the Vestals with public reverence. If a condemned criminal happened to meet a Vestal on the way to execution, his sentence could be pardoned. Crowds would move aside in the streets to let them past. They were greeted almost like divine figures walking among mortals. Statues were raised in their honour, and their faces became known throughout the city as symbols of purity and sacred beauty. The flip side of this reverence was a near total loss of autonomy. The Vestals were constantly observed, their lives were ruled by ritual, and every action was measured against the strict code of their service. Unlike other women, they could not marry, they could not form relationships, and they could not leave the cloister of their duty. For all their property, their carriages, and their seats at the games, their lives were tightly controlled, and their choices were almost non-existent. The duality of their existence was striking. To the people of Rome, the Vestals seemed almost divine. Women elevated far above the ordinary limits of their sex. They were honoured, wealthy, and untouchable in law, but within the walls of the Atrium Vestae, they lived under restrictions that few could bear. They were both worshipped and confined, privileged yet trapped. The grand palace that glittered in the Forum was, for them, a gilded prison from which there was no escape. So let us now see what strict rules governed the lives of the Vestal Virgin. Their existence was bound by 3 absolute laws that could never be broken. The first was perpetual virginity, which meant they were forbidden to marry or have any form of intimacy for the entire 30 years of their service. The second was absolute obedience to the priests, and especially to the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest who oversaw them. The third was the guardianship of the sacred flame in the Temple of Vesta, a fire that was never supposed to go out. These 3 laws dictated the activity of their daily life. The most visible symbol of their duty was the flame itself. To the Romans, it was not just a fire, but the very heart of their civilization. In private homes, the hearth fire represented family unity, warmth, and survival. At the level of the state, the flame in Vesta's temple symbolized the endurance and stability of Rome itself. If that fire burned brightly, the empire stood firm, but if the flame was extinguished, it was seen as a sign that Rome's fortunes could collapse. People believed that the loss of the fire meant that the goddess had withdrawn her favor. Because of this belief, the responsibility placed on the Vestals was enormous. Even the smallest mistake could be seen as an omen of disaster. If the fire went out, the blame fell directly on the shoulders of the women who tended it. The consequences were harsh. The Vestal who failed in the sacred task could be punished with scourging, a ritual beating carried out by the Pontifex Maximus himself. But because of the sanctity of the Vestals and the need to preserve their public image, the punishment was not delivered in the open. Instead, it was performed in darkness and secrecy, with curtains drawn, so that the dignity of the priestess would not be openly shamed, even as she suffered. The secrecy did not make the punishment less terrifying. For the young women, the knowledge that one lapse, even an accident, could bring physical pain and public suspicion must have created constant anxiety. They were always watched both by the priests who oversaw them and by the citizens who believed the safety of Rome rested in their hands. If the flame flickered, if a ritual was not performed exactly as prescribed, rumors could spread quickly. Such rumors were dangerous. They could spark official investigations, and once a Vesta was accused, the trial itself carried heavy pressure. In many cases, guilt was assumed from the beginning because the Romans feared the risk of angering the gods by showing mercy. A whisper of misconduct could become a case of divine offence, and the priestess at the centre of it would find herself with little chance to defend her name. The psychological weight of this system was immense. The Vestals lived in luxury compared to other women, but they also lived with the knowledge that even small mistakes could ruin them. Their daily routine, full of rituals and duties, was meant to keep the sacred flame alive, but it also served as a constant reminder of the fragile line they walked between honour and disgrace. So far, we've only discussed punishment for real or perceived errors in ritual. If the Romans believed that the smallest failures could signal disaster for the state, can you imagine what happened when a Vestal committed the ultimate violation of her vows? Now the tension moves from mistakes and punishment to the most feared taboo of all. Surely you're wondering, what could be worse for a Vestal Virgin than letting the sacred flame go out? The answer was breaking of her vow of chastity, an offence the Romans considered not only a personal failing, but a threat to the survival of the entire state. A Vestal's purity tied directly to the safety of Rome. If she became impure, the whole city was thought to be stained with pollution, and the anger of the gods could fall upon everyone. The Romans gave this offence a special name, Crimen Incesti. The term literally meant the crime of unchastity. But for the Romans it went far beyond a simple private matter. It was considered sacrilege, a violation against the divine order itself. Because the Vestals represented Rome's hearth, their virginity was not just a personal vow, it was a guarantee of divine protection for the empire. To break it was to invite disaster. Accusations of Crimen Incesti were rare, but when they appeared, they created an enormous scandal. Trials of accused Vestals were tense public events where the dignity of the priestesses clashed with the fear of divine punishment. Yet these trials were often shaped more by politics than by evidence. Rumours or suspicions, especially during troubled times, were enough to begin an investigation, and once accused, a Vestal had few chances to defend herself. The outcome usually depended on the political climate and the will of powerful men, rather than on a fair hearing. One of the earliest well-known cases occurred in 216 BC, during a time of deep crisis for Rome after its defeat by Hannibal at Cannae. Two Vestals, Opimia and Floronia, were accused of breaking their vows. Both were condemned and the men involved were executed. The Romans believed that the gods had punished them for the impurity of the Vestals, and the city turned its fear and anger upon the accused. Perhaps the most politically charged case occurred during the reign of Emperor Elagabalus in the early 3rd century AD. The young emperor, already despised by the Roman elite for his religious reforms and unconventional behaviour, was accused of violating the sacred vows of the Vestal Virgin. According to hostile sources written after his death, Elagabalus was said to have corrupted multiple Vestals, turning their sacred duties into personal indulgences. However, these accusations appear conveniently after his assassination in 222 AD, when his enemies sought to justify their actions and blacken his memory. The charges against him were likely fabricated, a way to paint his entire reign as an offence against the gods and Roman tradition. This case shows how Crimen Incesti could be used as the ultimate political weapon, a charge so serious that it could retroactively justify even the murder of an emperor. Whether true or false, the accusation served its purpose. It branded Elagabalus not just as a bad ruler, but as a man who had endangered Rome itself through sacrilege. These cases reveal how fragile the position of the Vestals could be. They were honoured as holy figures, yet when suspicion fell upon them, their sacred status offered no protection. Instead, it made them perfect scapegoats whose fall from grace turned into dramatic public spectacle. The very women who were supposed to guarantee Rome's safety became symbols of corruption and divine anger once they were accused of failing. It is also important to note that the men involved with them were not ignored. The Romans saw intimacy with a Vestal as an attack on the state itself. A man who dared to break this taboo endangered all of Rome. For this reason, many of them faced death as well, executed alongside or soon after the Vestal. The trials and punishments for Crimen Incesti stood apart from all other crimes in Rome. No other offence combined personal morality, religion, and politics in such a dangerous way. The entire weight of Roman superstition and state power fell upon the accused, and once condemned, there was only one fate awaiting the Vestal. When a Vestal Virgin was found guilty of breaking her vow of chastity, she would be condemned to death. Yet there was also a problem. Like every other part of their life, even the execution of a Vestal was dictated by divine reverence and mystic ceremony. Because Vestals were sacred, no Roman could shed their blood without risking the anger of the gods. The solution was a punishment that avoided direct killing, but was no less horrifying. The guilty Vestal was condemned to be buried alive. The place chosen for this grim ritual was called the Campus Sceleratus, or Field of the Wicked. It lay just outside Rome's city walls, near the Colline Gate, where the sight of it would remind citizens of both the Vestal's sacred role and the cost of their failure. This was not a battlefield execution or a public spectacle of torture. It was presented as a solemn ritual where Rome claimed it was not killing the Vestal, but rather handing her over to the gods to decide her fate. The final journey of the condemned Vestal was staged with a terrible irony. She was dressed as a bride, wearing the bridal veil as if she was going to be married, but her marriage would be to death itself. In silence, she was led in a procession through the Roman Forum. Citizens watched as the figure passed, veiled and solemn, everyone knowing that this was not a wedding march, but a funeral. Ancient historians describe how the atmosphere was hushed, heavy with dread, for even in their anger, Romans recognized the horror of what they were about to witness. The destination was an underground chamber prepared in advance. Inside, the room was made to look like a living space, but a twisted version of it. A small bed was placed inside, along with a lamp, some bread, a jug of water, and a little milk. These provisions were symbolic. They allowed Rome to claim that it had not starved the Vestal or struck her down with weapons. Instead, she was left to the gods, abandoned beneath the earth with the bare minimum of supplies. By doing this, the Romans could say they were not guilty of her death, even though everyone knew she would soon die in suffocating darkness. Once the Vesta was placed inside, the ritual reached its final stage. The entrance was sealed with earth and heavy stones, trapping her beneath the ground. No prayers were offered and no tombstone was raised. Her name was not honored or remembered. She was erased from Roman memory as if she had never existed. The purity that once made her almost untouchable had now condemned her to one of the most merciless deaths imaginable. The cruel irony is impossible to miss. Roman society had worshipped these women as living symbols of purity, granting them privileges no other woman enjoyed. Yet when one was judged to have failed, that same society turned to ritual execution of the harshest kind. In life, she had been revered as a near-divine figure. In death, she was cast away like a criminal whose existence had stained the city. This punishment was not just a legend. Ancient writers such as Livy and Plutarch describe it in detail. They recorded the procession, the entombments, and the way Rome sought to cloak the execution in the language of ritual. The burial of a Vestal Virgin was one of the darkest realities of Roman religion, proving that beneath the grandeur of temples and ceremony lay a system that demanded absolute obedience, enforced by fear of the most terrifying fate a Roman could imagine. So have you ever heard of this chilling ritual before? The idea of burying someone alive, all in the name of purity and Rome's survival, is almost impossible to imagine today. Was it fear, faith, or politics that kept this tradition alive? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.